Hello, and welcome to the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. My name is Kelly Blahos, and I am the editorial director of our online foreign policy magazine, Responsible Statecraft. I am honored today to be moderating this critical panel, the U.S. as Peacemaker in Central Africa. If you do not know about the Quincy Institute, if this is your first time on one of our panels, we are an action tank that is dedicated to reorienting U.S. foreign policy towards diplomacy and away from militarization. And so we're very happy to have you here. Our discussion today will focus on attempts at ending the bloody conflict between the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda-backed rebels M23 in the DRC, a conflict that has displaced 7 million people so far within the country. According to the DRC government, some 7,000 people have been killed in the fighting since January. But taken into dark perspective, this country, which has a higher mortality rate than any country in sub-Saharan Africa, has lost some 7 million people to conflict and humanitarian crisis since 1998. The crushing irony here is that the DRC is the richest country in the world resource-wise, but among the top 5 poorest countries in the world based on standard of living. The DRC holds most of the gold, cobalt, copper, and coltan resources in the world, elements essential for most of our electronic devices, cars, and modern technology, but the perfect storm of corruption, foreign exploitation, and conflict have left this country in humanitarian despair. The current conflict involves players in the DRC's 9 adjacent countries, but none more than Rwanda, which is backing the M23 rebels. Not only have rebels taken prisoners, and according to recent reports by Amnesty International, tortured and killed them, but sent people fleeing and took over mining to fuel the conflict. And they may be the chief militancy here, but other militant groups like the FDLR and ADR also terrorize the region and seek to take over resources. Reports of smuggling abound. So why are we here today? Because the United States has pledged to help mediate a peace agreement. A preliminary deal was advanced by both the DRC and M23 earlier this month in the White House. Here to talk about that, how a new minerals deal may help to cement a peace, and how regional dynamics are both harming and helping, is an all-star panel of experts. And I am looking forward to teasing this all out, and moreover, get some sense of whether there is any optimism that could be had involving the US and regional leaders, that they can break this horrid cycle of pain for the people of the DRC that dates back, frankly, to more than a century. So let me introduce our panelists, and then we can get to the discussion. Beverly Oshang is a senior analyst in Control Risk's Global Risk Analysis Service. Based in Dakar, she is responsible for the coverage and analysis of Francophone Africa within the Sub-Saharan Africa team. She supports the monitoring and reporting for political, economic, and security trends in at least 15 Francophone African nations, while specializing in the militancy and socioeconomic dynamics in the Sahel and regional geopolitics. Prior to joining Control Risk, Beverly worked as an Africa specialist with BBC Monitoring. Joshua Walker is the Director of Programs of the Congo Research Group at New York University Center on International Cooperation. He has been working and researching the Democratic Republic of the Congo, DRC, since 2004. Before joining CIC, he was a research associate at the Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research in Johannesburg. He also worked for the Carter Center and the United Nations Peacekeeping Mission in the DRC. And finally, my colleague, Dan Ford, is a junior research fellow in the Global South program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Previously, Dan worked as a research and communications assistant at the Global Interagency Security Forum, an organization focused on supporting the safety and security of humanitarian and development professionals across the world. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you to our audience as well. Just a reminder, if you do have questions for our panelists, I will be monitoring the Q&A, and hopefully we'll get to a few of those at the end of our discussion. But first, I would love for Joshua basically to set the table for us. Can you talk a little bit, I guess, about what you're seeing as the main conflict? How did we get here with the DRC, the M23, and some of the other militant actors before we go further in terms of like talking about the potential peace agreements?
Thanks very much, Kelly, for the question, and thank you to the Quincy Institute for the invitation. So I think it's important to note here that, although this news about the M23 and Rwanda and the Congo really started making headlines earlier this year, for people who watch the region and the DRC, this has been something that's been going on for the last several years. So in November 2021 was actually when the M23 re-entered Congo. The M23 is a group led by Congolese Tutsi, which has certain grievances or claims having to do with discrimination against Tutsi people and Kinyarwanda speakers more broadly in the DRC. And so, over a period of the last several years, the M23, with Rwandan support, has gradually taken more and more territory first in North Kivu and then much more recently in South Kivu province. And so by the time we got to January, when Goma fell, this had already been going on for several years. As Kelly mentioned, the M23 is backed by Rwanda, and that means both boots on the ground. The UN group of experts had estimated around 4,000 troops last year, Rwandan troops, as well as very sophisticated equipment that you do not see with other armed groups in the region, things like surface-to-air missiles and GPS jamming and spoofing capabilities. The M23 had already invaded, in fact, Goma once before in 2012, again with Rwandan backing. And at that time, Rwanda, through a mixture of diplomatic pressure from the US and others, was compelled to withdraw its support. And ultimately, the M23 was militarily defeated and forced to leave the Eastern Congo. So, how did we get here? So I think it's important to note that although we understand that the M23 claims to be fighting on behalf of Congolese Tutsi and discrimination and xenophobia against Congolese Tutsi, we've actually seen in our analysis an uptick in that same discrimination following the M23 reinvasion of the DRC, and not as much as a response to something that existed before. And at the same time, Rwanda speaks a lot about the presence of the FDLR. This is the former génocidaires who've been in Eastern Congo for the last several decades, saying the DRC hasn't done enough to dismantle this group. And this is a justification for what they call officially their defensive postures or defensive measures. But so initially we had this sort of set of issues. And then at the end of 2023, a new dimension was brought in when something called the AFC, or the Alliance Fleuve Congo, the Congo River Alliance, was created and launched in a Nairobi hotel room. And this group is sort of a Congolese face to what has been perceived as an entirely foreign-backed rebellion led by the former Electoral Commission head, who was instrumental in bringing Tshisekedi to power in the first place. And this AFC, together with the M23, has had much larger claims and much broader grievances that actually have to do with governance in the DRC, and even going so far as to say that they want to go to Kinshasa and take down President Tshisekedi. Over the last few years, there had been a couple of regional processes ongoing, and I think Beverly will talk about that, but just to say that the Luanda process, which was initially designed to mediate between the DRC and Rwanda, that was being led by President Lourenço of Angola, fell apart in December last year when Rwandan President Kagame refused to attend a final meeting in Luanda that would have probably resulted in the signing of a peace deal. And so as we get to 2025, we see Goma fall, much to the chagrin of the Congolese, demonstrating the weakness of the Congolese army, but also of the UN peacekeeping mission and of the Southern African regional peacekeeping mission that was in the city. Around February, we start hearing talk of a security for minerals deal that the Congolese are floating with the new Trump administration. Then we see in March, to everyone's surprise, Qatar emerge as a mediator, managing to bring the two presidents, Congo and Rwanda, together in Doha, followed by I would say, greater efforts at mediation by the US and the naming of senior advisor Massad Boulos to be the sort of point person on this file. Um, and so today, what we have are a few things. One, we have this ongoing mediation process that's being done by Qatar, by the African Union, and the United States, each group sort of supposedly taking different pieces of the conflict that they're mediating. And then domestically in Congo, we see that President Tshisekedi, who was really weakened, I think, in January and February when Goma and Bukavu fell, struggling to sort of reconstitute some kind of a political coalition. So um, in the last couple of days, very strangely, we've seen a kind of rapprochement between Tshisekedi and Martin Fayulu, who was the actual winner of the 2018 elections and who had spent years describing himself as the legitimately elected president, opposed to President Tshisekedi, now seemingly coming together with him in a kind of patriotic front against both the Rwandan-backed invasion and the Congolese opposition members who seem to have rallied to that cause. Most notably, former President Joseph Kabila, who crossed into Goma from Rwanda several days ago, and who has been there officially for consultations um, with various groups in civil society, as well as with the M23 and the AFC. And so this is where we stand today, and I think I'll leave it at that.
Wow, there's so much to unpack there. So I am going to sort of channel the parts of our audience who are coming here for maybe for the first time and learning about this conflict, at the very, I want to say superficial level, but entry level. I have two quick questions for you because I want to go on and I don't want to belabor it with and get us too far afield. But one, what does this does this have anything to do with the dynamics, the conditions that caused the Rwandan genocide of the 1990s? Because you mentioned the Rwanda and the Tutsis. Is this an ethnic conflict? I know that that's oversimplifying it, but just for our general audience, is this an overhang or an outgrowth from an ongoing ethnic conflict from the genocide of the 1990s?
I would say that the conflict over the last several decades in the Eastern Congo is certainly an extension of or a consequence of the Rwandan genocide. And while ethnicity certainly plays a role, I wouldn't say that this is an ethnic conflict per se. I think that there are certain ethnic claims that are mobilized, certainly to justify the conflict by the M23 and by Rwanda. But I think this also has a fair amount to do with Rwandan desire for having a zone of influence and control within certain parts of Eastern Congo, as well as obviously access to some of the minerals for refineries in Rwanda. And that's partly why the United States is trying to bring Rwandan refining into a peace deal.
Thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. I realize this is so much more complicated than just an ethnic issue. But can I just ask you quickly about Joseph Kabila? He has actually crossed over into Goma. I saw the news. Is he actually siding with M23 against his Congolese countrymen? Am I describing that accurately, or
So
what's going on there?
his official position, from what we can tell, both from his statements and from what his supporters and close confidants say, is that he is there for consultations with people who have been affected by conflict. But obviously, the Congolese government sees this as an affront and as a kind of declaration of war. I'm not sure if they've used that term, but already in the lead up to Kabila crossing into Goma, his political party had been targeted by the Congolese state. He himself, they had removed his parliamentary immunities such that he can be pursued for treason by the military court in DRC. And so President Tshisekedi has said for months now, in fact, that Kabila is behind the M23.
Hmm.
Publicly, he is saying he doesn't seem to want to take a firm stance and say that he is. But on the other hand, the fact that he's in Eastern Congo for many, being hosted in effect by the M23 is a kind of taking of sides.
What do you think personally is going on here?
I think that he is looking to play a role in sort of however this conflict is resolved. And he may not actually be sure himself what exactly that role will be. A lot of people suspect that he wants to come back to power and that this would be something that, for example, Rwanda might be amenable to. But I'm not too clear that that's necessarily what he wants or necessarily what the Congolese people would accept. And so I think he's trying to play a role. I think, though, that because he's in Goma, because of some of the statements he's made, it would be difficult for him to try to act as a kind of mediator, as a kind of international statesman, former head of state. I think that he's too perceived now as having taken sides.
Okay, thank you, Joshua. Let's move on to Beverly. Can you please talk about the broader regional implications of the conflict? DRC has 9 members or 9 neighbors. How are they playing a role to either help or harm peace moving forward? What about even farther out, like as Joshua mentioned, UAE and Qatar?
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, there's been a power outage, so I'm kind of out in public. I mean, to begin with, as Joshua rightly pointed, there are various neighboring countries that do have armed groups with roots in those regions, but are also active in Eastern DRC. So you have ADF or Islamic State, which has Ugandan roots and is ideologically opposed both to President Museveni and also preaching an extremist Islamist ideology. You have Red Tabara, which is a dissident group from Burundi. It has been historically against the government. You have FDLR, which is a Rwandan dissident group, which has roots in the genocide. And then this has always made the conflict a very regional issue and contributed to not just tense relations between those armed groups and their governments, but also DRC and its neighboring countries. And DRC, because it's a rare base for the activities of these rebel and armed groups, those respective governments sometimes do engage in tensions or in confrontations with the government. The RC is also a member of the Southern African Development Community, and as of 2022, it joined the East African Community because it was hoping to receive additional support, both in terms of armed intervention as well as diplomatic and peace process to stabilize the East. Underlying this is the fact that with the East African countries in particular, this was the only entryway through which economic opportunities would be able to support the DRC. But rather than achieving strength in numbers, that's the interesting thing. DRC has only ended up being more fractured in its regional partnerships. There's been so many processes to drive the peace in the East. So Angola overseeing a diplomatic process, which has so far not really managed to bring Kagame, the president of Rwanda, and Tshisekedi, DRC's president, to the table. You've had Kenya, which had to pull out the regional force that it was leading because of certain failures or certain expectations around what it was supposed to achieve, which was direct fighting, but the Kenyan contingent was there to secure areas that were being occupied by M23 to enable business as well as humanitarian operations. And then you have the SADC that brought in its forces initially, and then the lack of clarity of a chain of command led to confrontations and also deaths among peacekeepers, or what had been characterized by South Africa as peacekeepers. And so instead, again, of those strength in numbers, we're seeing that there are competing interests, both by the armed groups, by the respective governments that are involved in the peace processes, by DRC's politicians themselves, and even the politicians within the region. And so in a way, it has ended up harming the peace process rather than giving it reasonable support. And then you now find that it's being further externalized because it feels as if an incapacity within the regional stakeholders to be able to stabilize DR Congo is bringing in a lot more international engagement.
Beverly, is that international engagement because of the mining? What is the incentive for the more external involvement from other countries like Qatar, UAE, and others beyond the region.
Well, yes, I mean, Qatar coming into the peace process is because it does have high stakes in the Rwandan flag national carrier, Rwanda. It has a nearly 49% stake. It's also supporting the building of airports within the country. So there are reputational risks around Rwanda being linked to the conflict in the east. And so Qatar is playing a mediatory role. Even though it says on paper that it's not being driven by any sort of interest, we do know that it has economic interest. The UAE in 2023 signed a $1.9 billion deal with a state-owned mining entity in DR Congo. Part of it was to be able to develop 4 industrialized mining areas in Sud Kivu and Maniema. And so instability in Nord Kivu in particular is a threat to those business interests. And so supporting political and peace processes would be in its interest, because the activities of armed groups would then undermine those operations and that partnership. So broadly speaking, the Eastern region has high leverage because of those minerals, but of course, because of the long running and standing activities of these groups, and because of the various competing interests of even the interregional governments, it becomes a very difficult conflict to mediate and to stabilize.
Yeah, I mean, I'm overwhelmed with the complexity of this conflict. Just hearing you speak on it in the last 30 seconds or so, I guess a question that that begs to be asked here is, if there are external, or I mean foreign owners of the mines, can you talk a little bit about who owns the mines in the DRC, and have they fled because of the fighting? Because from what I understand, and from your description as well, that some of these groups have actually taken territory and are using the mines to fuel their the conflict. Can you talk a little bit about where the foreign ownership, where that situation is at this point?
Well, yeah, I mean, for the most part, there have been formal operations in Sud Kivu and Maniema, and we know that M23 has been largely active in Nord Kivu and operating near even that border with both Rwanda and Uganda. Now, because of that, it has meant that a lot of the minerals that are being exploited within that region, in many instances, have gone through either smuggling, or that armed groups have been involved in some of the supply chain and the value chain in the region. So they have been, so conflict minerals in DRC are a reality, whether you're involving European actors, whether you're involving Chinese, or you're involving the Middle Eastern companies that are involved in that region. Now, operating in a high risk environment means that they do place a lot of premium when it comes to security and securing the region. And the lack of clear state control means that in some instances, both illegal miners, particularly illegal miners who are coming from within the region, not just Congolese nationals, but people from Uganda who are coming into the country, from Tanzania, even as far as Kenya, who are mining in this region, they have to cut deals with some of these armed groups in order to be able to move supplies or to be able to operate in the region. It's much more complex for the more formal mining companies. They would have to either subcontract security services, they would be able to have convoys being provided by the government. And there have been instances whereby during government intervention in an armed insurgent group operations, there are some reputational issues that do emerge, not just from the direct trade of minerals that could be linked to the conflict, but also in the style that the government is often purported to deal with the insurgency, which sometimes is tied into human rights abuses. So it's quite a complex and complicated environment when you have to navigate through areas which are key transit routes that are under the control of armed groups, when you have to be able to deploy or support security forces to be able to not just protect the mining area, but also to ensure that your personnel and assets are able to move within the region with ease and move outside of the eastern region. And then there's also the fact that neighboring countries, and they have denied this, like Rwanda in particular, and even Uganda, being linked to those conflict minerals, even though they themselves do have their own minerals in their countries, because of the fact that the armed groups have a bit more control in the eastern region. It means that they're able to source some of those minerals without having to necessarily go through certain due process, such as, licensing, registration, or even being able to track where those minerals are coming from. So it's quite complicated when you look at that scenario.
Yeah, and you get a better picture of why the DRC is so poor, because there's tons of resources and tons of business and investment going on, but it's being peeled off in many different directions.
Yes, it barely goes through, the formal, the Ministry of Mines, for instance, or even formal registration. And because you already have a very porous border region, if you're looking at that area going into Rwanda or Uganda, it means that in many instances, things would have to go to Kinshasa. It's a much longer distance. So instead of that, you simply divert through the outside channels of the East.
Wow. Well, we'll get back to some of that in a little bit, but I wanted to bring the conversation to Washington, where Dan is at right now, and talk a little bit about what the Trump administration is trying to do. It was inaugurated in January, and within just a few months, the administration has instigated peace talks, as described by Joshua, between the DRC and M23. Dan, can you give us a sense of the dynamics leading up to this, like what the expectations are and what kind of diplomatic tools that they have to try and make this all work, which seems to be an impossible task?
Sure. Thanks, Kelly, for the question. And excited to be on this panel with my co-panelists. So taking a step back a little bit, the Biden administration had been largely quite absent from Africa. But near the end of his administration, he did take a trip to Angola to help sort of solidify his role in this, what's known as the Libido Corridor, this infrastructure project that the U.S. is partially funding. And while he was there, there were reports after actually that he left office that he was trying to get both parties to come together, Rwanda and the DRC. In Rwanda, that was the goal as part of the sort of broader Angola process that Joshua laid out earlier. That never came to fruition. Trump took over, and I think the early expectation was that there would be very little focus on Africa. There's been a lot of crises around the world that the administration has had to deal with. And it was not clear if the administration was going to see Africa as beneficial enough to put sort of diplomatic resources into, and financial commitment to try and solve some of these conflicts. But the administration, to their credit, has really descended on this conflict and has centered their African foreign policy, especially as it relates to trying to strike peace in some of these challenging conflicts on the continent, on this one. And within a couple months, there were reports that the administration was going to nominate Massad Boulos to serve as, originally it was reported, special envoy to the Great Lakes region, which is a very standard position that many administrations have had in the past. And the DRC Rwanda is very much in the center of the Great Lakes region, so that would task Boulos with trying to end this conflict, and of course, as it relates to U.S. interests. It turns out he was actually put in a position that is broader, senior advisor, which allows him to do a whole lot, this conflict and other conflicts. And Boulos, it should be noted, he's the father-in-law to Tiffany Trump. So he has a connection in that way to the administration. He did serve as an advisor while the administration was transitioning over after the election, before the inauguration, on sort of broad foreign policy issues, and he has some experience in Africa in the automotive sector, but not really diplomatically. So this was sort of a big task to hand him, but it coincided with, as Joshua laid out, the Qatari sort of peace breakthrough, which happened on March 18th. It was sort of out of nowhere. All the folks who follow this were really surprised when it happened, because it was right after Angola basically gave up, said that we've done what we can, and there was little breakthrough in other efforts in the past. And Boulos and the administration smartly decided to sort of tag along and be a part of the inner negotiations. There was an image with both presidents in Doha with the Qataris, and that was right around the time when Boulos took over as senior advisor. And in the weeks after that, he was part of all the negotiations. He helped facilitate some of the dialogue. And in early in early April, or in late April, I should say, the foreign ministers of the DRC and Rwanda were in Washington to sign what they called a Declaration of Principles at the State Department, with Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, there between them. Sort of a tense meeting, obviously tense conflict, but it was a very big showcase for the administration to signal kind of the role that they've had in trying to move this a couple steps closer towards peace. And the Declaration of Principles laid out, one, it made both sides commit on paper to coming to a full and long-term peace deal. And it set a deadline for when each side was going to submit drafts. And a couple weeks later, both sides did submit drafts in Qatar, and Boulos was sort of present throughout this whole process. The administration has honed in on it. So obviously, the question arises to the casual viewer might be, why does the U.S. care? Why is the U.S. focusing on this conflict and not others on the continent to the same extent? And as Joshua and Beverly have talked about, I mean, I think the mineral wealth is a major reason why. There are always challenges that national interests that arise from conflict spreading, and one of those is economic interest. The U.S. clearly sees economic benefit in accessing these mines, accessing some of the minerals that are critical to a lot of technology, including electric vehicles. And the U.S. has really been left. They've been behind the curveball on responding to some of the economic benefits that region offers. For a long period in the 90s during the Cold War, the U.S. was sort of centrally focused on a lot of the mineral wealth in Africa, because we've known of this wealth for some time and it's been useful before. And then with the global war on terror starting after 9/11, a lot of that shifted to terrorism, CT operations, counterterrorism, and some security work. And a lot of the access to mining rights wasn't as central a focus in Washington. And over the years, a lot of American companies that had access to mines, controlled mines, used mines, has sold the mines to foreign companies, a lot of them being Chinese. Now, I think Chinese companies own 80% of cobalt operations in that area. And it's not that the U.S. government hasn't realized in the past the importance of this region. Tom Perriello, who served as special envoy to the Great Lakes region under Obama, did actually mention this to senior administration officials, that the U.S. needs to be a bit more active in trying to encourage investment and persuade American companies to keep their mines. That didn't come through. A lot of American companies, including some really big ones, sold mines. So, I think this is in response to the dynamic, the sort of global economy, which the Trump administration has sort of made as a central theme. We can see that through a lot of their trade policy. They see access to these mines as being quite essential to American interests. And by being a central mediating party to this conflict, the Americans feel like they can, they can help. This can be sort of the door to open their access to the mines. And should be noted that there are two separate agreements that the U.S. right now is in process of negotiating with each country on mineral access, one with the DRC and one with Rwanda. Obviously, the DRC's, one would imagine, will be much more substantial, but both countries do have mineral wealth, and that's something that, it might come out, the deals might be made public around the time the peace agreement is signed, but probably a little after. And we can see the extent to which, the U.S. benefited in that way from trying to get a deal done here between the two belligerents.
Before I go on, I've been told that we are only hearing audio from Beverly. We're not seeing her. I see her just fine where I'm at in our little, say, green room. So I've been enjoying the back and forth, but I understand that our viewers aren't seeing Beverly, which is unfortunate, but she had to get on a different line to make sure that her internet was clear and crisp. So just wanted to put that out there, that there was a reason behind that. Dan, just to stick with you for a second, Beverly had described a pretty fraught situation in terms of like the different militancies on mining territory that were smuggling, exploiting, these resources. Can you talk a little bit, and I don't know if there's a concise answer for this, but if the US strikes these deals with both DRC and Rwanda, what guarantee will there be that they will be able to maintain the seamlessness or integrity of such agreements with these various militancies and security issues happening on the ground? I guess without the US sending in their own security teams to actually safeguard the resources and these mines.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's, that would be a central challenge, any peace deal, whether it's on the peace front, whether it's on access to some of the mineral sites and refineries. From what I've seen, some of the reporting suggests that there's going to be a committee of several countries, including the US, I think France, Togo, UK, I believe is there, that will help oversee the peace deal once it's implemented and ensure that, parties are following the regulated element of the peace agreement long term. And then if that peace agreement is sustained, that'll help, all foreign companies that have either access to mines or are in some way involved in infrastructure building or the logistical transportation of resources and minerals. But regardless, even if this peace deal does come to fruition, as Joshua and Beverly laid out, there are a lot of groups involved. And I think it would be a little naive to assume that suddenly, there's going to be peace and the borders are going to stay, very sort of strongly where they currently are, and everyone's going to move forward with nice mineral deals. It's going to there's going to be some form of conflict. Now, it's important to note that a lot of the mineral wealth and a lot of these refineries and a lot of the mining sites are not located where this conflict is. Now, they could be, the conflict could continue to spread. Many are located there, but many are located elsewhere. So these deals that the US is looking to strike would allow access to mines elsewhere in these countries. And then hopefully the US would like to have these mines and then the resources connect to the Libido corridor, which it is in part funding, and the Trump administration has made clear that they're anticipating continuing funding the Libido corridor. Again, it's the big infrastructure project that is a G7 initiative. The US is a part of that. It connects the Angolan port on the western side of the continent all the way through the DRC. There'll be a bit into Zambia. And then there's an eastern portion that is actually being funded by the Chinese, known as the Tazara Railway, that will connect to Dar es Salaam on the Tanzanian port, and then through the Indian Ocean, allow access to the east. So, by connecting all of this together, that's one advantage that the US can see through these deals, just providing, and it's not just a rail line, the Libido corridor, it's also roads, it's other sort of infrastructure like solar paneling, big fields of solar panels. So, by providing access through corridors where there's peace and there's sort of consistent rail and truck networks, it can then connect to the ports and be a part of some of this global supply chain that the US wants to be more actively engaged in.
That's absolutely very hopeful in terms of what could be. Let's talk a little bit, and thank you for that. Let's talk a little bit, Joshua, about the leadership of Felix Tshisekedi. He comes after a long lineage of dictators and kleptocrats who have kept, to have kept the country from, as a whole, realizing all of this potential wealth. He pledged to make the reforms necessary to transition away from that long and sordid history. How is he navigating the conflict, and is he making good on his promises domestically?
Thanks, Kelly. So I think it's important to note, as I mentioned earlier, Tshisekedi came to power in 2019 in somewhat dubious circumstances because it was fairly widely understood that he had not actually won the 2018 elections. And he came to power initially in a kind of power sharing arrangement where former President Kabila's political coalition maintained the majority of seats in parliament and the majority of ministerial portfolios, and he had the presidency and a smaller number. And over a period of about a year and a half or two, he was able to force Kabila out and cause many of his supporters to defect to his camp. So there was a kind of original sin of this presidency that he's being reminded of now by his opponents. But nevertheless, at the beginning of his presidency, there were a lot of people who thought that there was still an opportunity, a window of opportunity for genuine reform. He comes from a political party that was the long-standing, and his father was the long-standing opponent of former President Mobutu, dating back to the 1980s. And so he came with a kind of lineage of, opposition bona fides, as it were. And this was part of the reason why I think there was a decent chunk of the Congolese population that were willing to accept the results, because he did come from that pedigree. And so there have been some, positive reforms. The IMF, which had suspended its lending with the DRC in 2012, resumed lending in December 2019. Tshisekedi made good on a promise that he kind of invented of free universal primary education, which is one of his kind of major policy achievements, even though it has a number of problems, and overall state revenues have increased. But there have also been serious blights on his domestic record. Although Tshisekedi had sort of vowed to really go after corruption, we've seen a number of people, including the current Speaker of the National Assembly, who were prominent politicians, indicted and convicted on corruption charges, go to jail, and then come back out and sort of, become, sort of enter back into the political sphere and into positions of power. We've also seen, we don't know exact figures, but particularly since 2022, huge, what we think to be really large expenditures on security that haven't really resulted in the security outcomes, obviously, that would have wanted to see. And I think it's safe to say that a lot of that money has been lost to embezzlement and corruption. And so now we find this, the dysfunction that pre-existed Tshisekedi's rule within the Congolese army has been, I think, accentuated under his rule. And obviously now this occupation of large parts of the crucial eastern provinces by a foreign power or its proxy is a huge blight on his record. In addition, although I think, particularly in the early days, there were a lot of symbolic things that they did regarding security, in the sense of certain roads in Kinshasa that had been blocked off under Kabila's tenure that no one could go on were sort of reopened, or there were things like, I remember being there and being surprised that people could take photos of the presidential motorcade passing by in Kinshasa without being arrested. There were a number of sort of symbolic things that he did early on, but lately in the last few years, we've seen a crackdown on liberties again, where the political space for dissent and opposition has been shrinking. We've seen journalists who were jailed for a number of months. Stani Boujakera, for example, from the Jeune Afrique publication. We've seen now, obviously, as I mentioned, Kabila's political party and its prominent members being harassed. They've just now said that today, I think, that Congolese media are not allowed to talk about former President Kabila anymore. So we've seen this crackdown. And so I would just say that, his response to this conflict, I think, on the one hand, has correctly been outrage, right? I mean, regardless of the serious problems with Tshisekedi's own governance, we are dealing with the illicit occupation at the behest of a neighboring country of large parts of the DRC. And so Tshisekedi has been outraged and has, at every turn tried to sort of speak against Rwanda in almost every international forum he's been in, even though Rwanda officially denies that it's supporting the M23, but it's an open secret that they are. But I think he's made some serious mistakes, both that led to this conflict and as the conflict has transpired. One of the things that we think kind of triggered the re-entry of the M23 into Congo was that Tshisekedi had invited in the Ugandan army into parts of North Kivu and Ituri province, ostensibly to go after the ADF, which is another very serious armed group linked to the Islamic State. And we think that this kind of got the Rwandans nervous, because they started seeing their neighbor and the DRC's neighbor, Uganda, with whom they had poor relations in 2021, being officially invited to bring their army into an area that was bumping right up against the areas that Rwanda considers to be its natural zone of influence. And so I think doing this invitation to Uganda without recognizing that this could trigger tensions with Rwanda was a mistake, a serious error on the Congolese part. Similarly, then bringing in the East African community, thinking that the East African community and the Kenyans, soldiers that Beverly mentioned, would take an offensive role against the M23 was probably misguided, given the regional dynamics in East Africa. And I think broadly speaking, Tshisekedi was probably misled or was under the illusion that the DRC could achieve a military victory over the M23 and the Rwandan Defense Force. And as we've seen, this hasn't happened. And then finally, I would say that, one of the things that he did starting last year was talk about changing the Constitution, which was interpreted by a lot of people as being an attempt to change the Constitution to allow him to run for a third term because his current term expires in 2028. And this served, I think, to galvanize the various opposition figures, both amongst one another. So we saw a crucial meeting in December last year between former President Kabila and Moise Katumbi, who was a candidate in the last election. And I think more broadly speaking, this has just sort of served in a sense to unite those opposition figures who have been frustrated with Tshisekedi's rule. That galvanized them. And then at the same time, we've seen a kind of overlap where now we see Kabila and Goma, and there is a certain kind of, I would say, a sort of convergence of interests between those in the M23 and their political backers who would probably like to see Tshisekedi gone, and those domestic political opponents who would also like to see Tshisekedi gone.
Wow, that's pretty complex in terms of the moving parts involved in this conflict, and it seems to me, and this kind of dovetails with a question that one of our viewers asked. What is Tshisekedi's relationship with the military? Is there a concern that there might be a coup? Is he giving them all the resources they need? You kind of hinted at the idea that perhaps some of those resources were being siphoned away for other things in the government. But does he have a good relationship with his own military? And is that part of the problem in terms of like the opportunities for invasion and occupation of the Eastern territories?
Yeah, I think that, so first of all, I would say, unlike his predecessor Kabila, who was a soldier, Tshisekedi is not a soldier. And so a lot of people cite that as an example of how he doesn't, really understand or empathize sufficiently with the life of a soldier. However, I think that it's important to remember that going back to the Mobutu days, the Congolese military was kind of deliberately initially fragmented, and parts of the military were played off against one another, precisely because at the time Mobutu feared a coup that could take him down. And so we've seen this perpetuation over decades now, where it's difficult to speak of the army as a kind of single actor that could commit a coup. We have, in addition to this earlier history, we have had waves of former combatants being integrated into the Congolese army under previous peace deals, who obey parallel chains of command. And so any attempt, I believe, at a coup would be met with a counter coup attempt from another part or another faction within the army. So I think the likelihood of a successful coup d'etat is probably not too big, but I think that, Tshisekedi in particular is suspicious of prominent generals, particularly from the Katanga region, which is where former President Kabila is from, and a number of whom have been put in prison. And he's tried to sort of promote some of his own people within the army and shift sort of some of the power bases. But the army itself it does not always act as a kind of single entity.
Let's move over to Beverly. Can we talk a little bit about the great power conflict influence and this conflict? I think you and/or Dan mentioned. Can you talk a little bit about China's role in so far as its ownership of the mines, its investments, its commitment to the region, and how that might have set off or at least inspired in part the Trump administration's very active role in trying to mediate this conflict?
I mean, certainly, yes. China has been a big player in the mineral sector, and it's increasingly getting inroads in the critical mineral sector, of which DRC has a substantial amount. And this is an area where we're seeing competition, particularly between the US and China. So it hasn't really been involved in the peace process. We do know that it has this stance of non-interference, no matter what's happening, even if it has tried to mediate in other places, not so much as prominent in DR Congo. And this is both on a formal level, and given the fact that the Chinese mining operators are both the formal large conglomerates as well as small hold operators in artisanal areas, which tends to be quite rampant in the region. But it's not necessarily in the active conflict zone, as we've pointed out. It's mostly Sud Kivu and Maniema. Of course, now that the conflict might be spilling over, especially when now M23 was clearly moving towards the Sud Kivu region, it meant that the stakes were going to be much higher, both on those mineral concessions, but also on which global powers were going to be involved in the region, including the UAE. Now, this has meant that, on one hand, the bigger conflicts and the bigger issues that have been dominating, the news cycle, whether it's the war in Ukraine, whether it was COVID-19, it often means that any conflicts in the region fall in the wayside. So despite DR Congo having a long-standing UN peacekeeping mission, despite there being various regional interventions, the impetus by the international community to call out some of the main actors in the conflict has not been that high. And even by the point when the Trump government was more or less moving towards possibly sanctioning certain Rwandan actors and even maybe Rwanda as a whole, it had gotten quite heightened. And it's interesting because it feels as if some of Rwanda's purported actions in the East may have been encouraged by the fact that the Trump administration would probably turn a blind eye on it. At the same time, when you look at the minerals deal that was being given to Ukraine, you'd say that Tshisekedi may have taken a similar template, even though in the end, it changed what US involvement will look like to be more economic and much more transactional and practical. But China throughout hasn't really been vocal about the conflict, whether it's on its own together with the government, whether it's at the UN Security Council, where obviously it does hold a lot of influence as a veto member and as one of the key parties, or even when you look at some of the operators within the region. There are mines in other parts of DRC that are being funded, say, by the China Exim Bank. So they do have broader interests that not necessarily are concentrated in the East. But obviously, when you look at the complicated involvement of the various actors, the fact that this might lead to a bit of a standoff between the US and China in the region, it means that the stakes are much more higher to be able to ensure that any concessions consider the interests of all of those parties. And I guess DRC has a lot more in terms of being able to leverage when it comes to who is it going to approach for peace and security.
Is there any involvement of Russia? One of our questioners has raised. They said, discuss China and Russia in Africa. Is Russia there, or do they have mercenaries anywhere in these territories?
I mean, there were the Romanian paramilitaries, which were formerly being deployed by the DR Congo government. And that's part of the tension, which has led to the army being undersupplied, and yet these Romanians being purportedly paid nearly $1,000 a month or so just to be able to operate the region. Then they were pulled out at the point when M23 had heightened operations and Rwandan forces were there and they were being paraded in Rwanda. Russia has dangled, at least at the time when the Wagner Group's former leader was alive, they did try to approach the DRC government to provide services, but they haven't formally been in the region. There have been some geologists spotted prospecting in the region, obviously, and that does lead to a lot of anxiety, particularly among Western actors, but they're not formally involved. They are within the region, of course. They're in the Central African Republic, which that entryway of the conflict has an impact on DRC. and they have tried to get into South Sudan through Sudan. But no, at the moment, Russian interests remain rather pragmatic. And I don't think at the moment they would be able to actually manage that conflict zone in the way they've been able to play about with the Sahel.
Yeah, that makes sense. One of the things that the Quincy Institute has been promoting within the organization on all levels is, more regional cooperation to take the place of, the United States coming in and intervening and imposing solutions on different parts of the globe. Can you talk a little bit, Beverly, about any of the regional organizations, but perhaps the African Union, that is doing anything to resolve this conflict, whereas you wouldn't need maybe a so far-flung outside actor coming in? Is that at all possible in the works?
So the African Union has mostly only voiced support for pre-existing peace process, and they were quite prominent at the point when Qatar had come in. Prior to that, there had been a statement at the point when Lorenzo had expressed some frustration of the fact that he was not able to get both Tshisekedi and Kagame on one side to be able to have discussions. And then there was a meeting at some point in April, which involved various leaders, including Mauritania, Burundi, Ghana, the Tanzanian ambassador, as well as the AUC chairperson. They did discuss the possibility of trying to move forward with the diplomatic process, but there was no clarity on what actual steps, or what measures would be put in place. The thing about the African Union is it's not really able to exert influence or force over most African countries. It tends to be a very delicate diplomatic act. It doesn't operate in the same way as, say, the EU Commission or the EU, whereby they would be able to put in an active monitoring mechanism in the event of a conflict, or they'd be able to impose certain measures against leaders when they're trying to resolve issues around contention between member states. The AU has mostly stood aside. They have once in a while issued a statement when they're condemning violence in the East or condemning the humanitarian situation. But they haven't, for instance, up until the point when Qatar was coming in, that is when they appointed an envoy, the Congolese president, to support the peace process. But ever since the resurgence of M23, there hasn't been really much action on its side. It's mostly left it to either the East African Community or the Great Lakes Commission, which Angola has been spearheading, or the SADC, which then deployed forces to the region. But on an institutional level, I suppose also the AU is quite overwhelmed by the various conflicts. In addition to DRC, there is Sudan, there's South Sudan, there's also Ethiopia, which is the seat of the African Union. And the general track record, including with DRC, has not been as profound.
Okay, I think we might have lost Beverly just for a second there. She froze up. Dan, can I continue this question with you? She was just mentioning Sudan and some of the other intransient conflicts in the region. What are your thoughts and your hopes for the Trump administration that it has the investment in the long game here in terms of mediating this conflict in the DRC? And what are you looking at for, I guess, the next steps in, post, the agreement, or what was it called? I'm sorry, it was what they signed in Qatar. Or was it in Qatar?
Yeah, so in Qatar, they provided draft proposals for a long-term peace agreement. They signed the Declaration of Principles in Washington.
The declaration, yes.
Yeah, and then they presented draft peace proposals, and the original reporting was that by mid-June they should be back in Washington to sign the full peace agreement. So we'll see if that comes to fruition. We're a couple weeks away. Maybe it'll be pushed back a bit further. And then, of course, the U.S. has their separate minerals deals with both the DRC and Rwanda that they're in the process of negotiating, and will they hope sign and come to a good agreement on. As it relates to the next steps, obviously the big step here is to make sure that any peace deal is followed by all parties. As I mentioned earlier, the U.S. is planning on putting together or being part of a committee that kind of oversees the peace agreement and make sure that all parties involved are following through. And then, of course, from the American perspective, again, it comes down to access to these minerals and access to some of the mining sites. So the Libido corridor is a big effort. It's a big project. It's already in operation a little bit on the west, but being able to connect it a bit further north is beneficial. I know one reason why Biden was unable to get these two to meet, Kagame and Tshisekedi, when he visited in December, in part was because there was some disagreement over, what role the Libido corridor could play. Rwanda obviously would like it to access Rwandan territory so that it can use Libido and not have to rely on routes that are currently in the DRC to send its minerals or to access other markets and other villages in the rest of the continent. So, to what extent can that corridor be integrated into maybe a broader rail and road network in that part of the continent that expands even beyond the original concept of Libido, which was really to connect a couple major mining sites with a couple big ports, and then provide access to the world. So how do we integrate that in a more full way? I think that's probably something that can be considered if there is a peace deal that comes to fruition. And then, on Sudan, that's an opportunity for the administration to play more of a diplomatic role. Now it's a little bit different because the mineral wealth is not quite the same, and it is. It's in some ways a more complicated conflict, in some ways a little less, but U.S. interests are a little bit less clear, I think, in Sudan as they are in the DRC. But I think, having an envoy, it could be Massad Boulos' next kind of effort here, to sit down with belligerents to the extent that he can, and foreign parties. Of course, we know that the UAE is a big contributor to that war with their support for the RSF. So, this can open the door. This can give the administration hope that they can actually strike some sort of a peace in other conflicts and hopefully move the ball forward to do so. But the administration does deserve credit for honing in on this conflict and trying to use American leverage where possible to get some peace negotiated.
I totally agree, and I'm sorry that we're out of time, but I guess it's a great sign that right after inauguration that the Trump administration sent these envoys forth, whether it be in the Middle East or Central Africa, to actually start the ball rolling on what promises to be a very long-term and complicated process, but at least they have begun that process. So I'm just so grateful that we were able to talk. It doesn't seem like it was enough time, and I apologize to the folks in the Q&A because there were some great comments, and some great questions as well. And this is just not one of those issues that we're going to tease out every angle within an hour. So I appreciate Joshua and Beverly and Dan, and I hope we can all reconvene at some point when these next steps emerge, and hopefully for the better in terms of the process. I'd like to, before everybody leaves, just give a notice for Monday, June 9th at 9 a.m. We have an event. We're going to be breaking down the South Korean presidential elections and the election of Lee Jae-myung of the Liberal Minju Party as the new president of South Korea. That election just happened on Tuesday. That would be yesterday. And so we have a great panel coming in to talk about that, led by our very own James Park at the Quincy Institute. So please go to the quincyinst.org events page to sign up for that. And thanks again to our panel and our audience. This was a very high level conversation, very detailed, very informative. And thank you to everyone, and hope to see you back on a Quincy Institute event.